analysis of rationalist metaphysics.
Yeah, right.
And just a couple of ideas here in paragraph 28, I think would be interesting. So if you have 28 in your English translation
Oh, yes, I
in
do.
front of you, so I will read and translate for you.
Okay, yeah.
Diese Wissenschaften betrachtete die Denkbestimmungen als die Grundbestimmungen der Dinge. So this science considered the determinations of thought. Denkbestimmungen. Bestimmung is a determination or a determinacy.
Oh,
So whatever was in thought, als die Grundbestimmungen, the basic determinations, der Dinge, of the things in the world. So if you had the idea of unity, there must be unity in the world. If you have the idea of cause and effect, there must be cause and effect in the world. And Hegel actually applauds that to some degree. Sie stand durch diese Voraussetzung, dass das, was ist, damit, dass es gedacht wird, an sich erkannt werde, höher als das spätere kritische Philosophieren. So she stood because of this presupposition, Voraussetzung. And what is this presupposition? Das, was ist, whatever is, damit, dass es gedacht wird, so by the fact that it is being thought, gedacht wird, erkannt werde is recognized or known an sich, in its own being. So you get the reality of things simply by thinking things. And this is something that Hegel likes because it's a basic presupposition or a thesis of his own philosophy, that thinking is not completely separate from being. Thinking is not an internal reorganization of knowledge that we gain by perception only, by experience only. Our thoughts do indeed contain the truth of things. But the criticism then goes beyond this basic principle, because that's okay. This kind of philosophy is even higher than Kantianism. It's higher than the later critical philosophy, that of course is Immanuel Kant and his pupils. Aber zum Ersten wurden jene Bestimmungen in ihrer Abstraktion als für sich geltend und als fähig genommene Prädikate des Wahren zu sein. So, in the first place, those determinations were taken in an abstract manner and considered to be valid on their own, für sich geltend. Und als fähig genommen and considered to be possible predicates of the true, or of the truth, but the true is literally what he says. So whatever comes in, whatever is part of your mind, which you can think, can be a predicate of the true, can be used as a predicate. Hegel has a very complex and very interesting theory of judgment. Judgment or proposition, because any statement with the form S is P, subject is whatever is in the predicate. I studied that for a while when I was still at the university. The history of how people think about propositions and what Hegel calls the speculative sentence, speculatieve Satz. So there is a way of expressing yourself in philosophy that goes beyond the normal idea of what a proposition is like, or what a proposition means. Because what is the normal idea of proposition? I think you can reproduce that for yourself, because that's part of our normal understanding of a language also. And let's say the table is white. So what is going on in that statement? Well, the table. We use the definite article because we want to talk about the table as a subject, as a subject of the sentence. So that's a logical element. However, it also refers to the thing in reality, the table that is out there.
Yeah.
And then we have the predicate, white. So I attribute whiteness to the subject. That's what a predicate does. It's attribution. Whiteness is connected to table. how do I express that connection? By a word that is called a copula in English grammar, which is the word is or are. Um, and that is a basic logical function of is. So, not to be confused with what we had in the Goethe poem, Über allen Gipfel ist Ruhe.
Yeah.
So there, ist has a totally different sense. It is like a verb in itself. But in the sentence, the table is white, is an auxiliary verb. It merely connects, it's copulate, merely connects
Yeah.
Subject and predicate. Now, what it ultimately means has been expressed, for instance, in the Middle Ages with the Latin term in esse. I'll write it down for you.
Yeah.
So, what the copula then does is to say that the predicate, did I spell it correctly? Yeah, in esse. So, what it actually expresses the proposition that the content of the predicate is within the reality of the subject. So we have the table with everything that it contains as properties, and the sentence expresses the fact that whiteness is part of that. But that is the reason that we can attribute white to the table, because the table actually is white. In reality, it has this property. So the attribution ultimately follows the property. We call it white because it is white. Simple.
Yeah.
And that's the way we talk about propositions. And then we can have propositions with the addition of all or many or some or just one. We can have a number, a quantity attached to it. And that might lead to what is called a syllogism, which is a combination of propositions where the conclusion follows the first and second argument, the two previous propositions. All men are mortal. All, every one of them. Socrates is a man. He's a human being. Therefore, conclusion, Socrates is immortal. And it's totally necessary to say it like that, because what does the conclusion say? Socrates is a human, is mortal. Yeah, of course, if all men are mortal and Socrates is part of this collection of beings that we call humans, then he shares the same property. All hammers are made of metal and wood. This is a hammer, therefore this hammer is made of metal and wood. Logical necessity. Now there is a problem with that. When we come to philosophical sentences, what if instead of saying the table is white, which is nice, a good expression of our experience, what if we say God is almighty? What is going on in a sentence like that? Or everything that is true. One of the propositions we found in our metaphysics course. Can you say that the subject refers to a reality? Can you say that the predicate is one of the properties of that subject? If we say being is, what can we say? Being is caused. Maybe we can say something like that. We have to make a distinction. We have to make a distinction between propositions that are analytical and are synthetic. You know that from Kant. Eh?
Yeah.
So if everything is analytical, we come to this rationalist metaphysics. The predicate is already contained within the subject, in essence. It's already contained in that. So what is a proposition? It's just the unfolding of something that we already have conceived. We can't say that with the whiteness of the table. That depends on our experience. But if we say a circle is round, then obviously round is part of the definition of a circle. So it's part of properties of a circle. So it's an analytic statement.
Yeah, it is.
Now, rationalist metaphysics thinks that everything is analytic. Every true statement has to be analytic. So the predicate must already be contained in the concepts that we express in the subject. So there is a
Yeah.
very neat distinction between statements based on experience that are not analytic and therefore not interesting for a rationalist metaphysics. They merely express experience, or they are not really propositions because they're synthetic. And then came Kant, who said, well, look at science. The most interesting statements in science are not the analytical ones.
Yeah, right.
The most interesting things are the synthetic ones. Birds can fly. That's interesting. The concept of bird doesn't contain the idea of flying. You can imagine a lot of birds that can't fly even. So that will be a
Yeah, right.
synthetic statement. That will be adding something to the subject that is not contained in the concept of the subject already. So in science, synthetic statements are way more interesting. And of course,
Yeah.
you know about the difference between a priori synthetic propositions and a posteriori synthetic proposition. So the table is white would be what kind of proposition according to Kant? Table is
Table
white.
is white. I think from what I remember, I am not a priori, maybe a priori or whatever.
It's
It's
not a
what
priori.
comes. Yeah, it's comes. I think a priori meant comes before experience, and
Yes.
as posteriori or I posteriori. I'm not sure. Yeah, but I think that means comes after experience. So I think table is white should be a posteriori. Yes, I think so. Yeah,
Synthetic a posteriori. Yep, that's
yeah,
exactly what it is. Which
yeah,
is not interesting for rational metaphysics. Might be
yeah,
interesting for some sciences that are more descriptive, but not
yeah,
really interesting for real science like cosmology or things like that. And you
yeah,
would have no analytic statements, but only synthetic a priori statements according to
yeah.
Kant's terminology. So you have something in mind. There's a concept in thought.
Yeah.
And by the way, neither Hegel nor the rationalist metaphysics ever start talking about language. They
Oh, I
don't
see.
consider language to be part of the equation. It's only concepts. And they think that language is not important because every concept can possibly be expressed in any language. So they might say language is not important because you can translate the word whatever you like, in whatever manner you like, but still the same concept. Let's say the circular. There's a Korean word for it, and a Dutch word for it, and a French word for it. Doesn't change the concept. It's a mathematical object.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, so why should we talk about language? And even
Yeah,
if we
right.
talk about the proposition, they say it's not depending on language because you can have the same thing in every language. Um,
Yeah, that's true.
but you have to think like that without language even, before or
Yeah.
beyond language. So that's the reason you won't find it. You won't find it in Hegel in that sense as well, only in an implicit way. But
Oh, I see.
every determination of thought is a possible predicate of the true, that is true reality or reality as a whole.
Yeah.
So, for instance, things like unity and let's say that everything has a shape, considered to be an analytic statement and all of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But what is he now questioning? He's not questioning the fact that thinking and reality really almost coincide or they belong together. He is
Yeah.
questioning the way it is expressed. And that's the next sentence. Jene Metaphysik setzte überhaupt voraus, so that kind of metaphysics presupposed in principle, that's the Erkenntnis des Absoluten, that's the knowledge of the Absolute, which is the only thing that is worth Hegel's time to know
Yeah.
the Absolute.
Yeah.
Not as a, let's say, as a subject beyond finite objects, but the Absolute, of course, tells me something about everything. It's
Yeah.
the absoluteness of the things, not something separate. That the knowledge of the Absolute could happen in this way, in der Weise, in this way, dass ihm Prädikate beigelegt werden. So that we could have this series of attributions. The absolute is unity, diversity, beauty, goodness, and so on and so on. That didn't deviate much from medieval philosophy, where being, of course, had these transcendental characteristics, like goodness and truth and all of that. And then untersuchte weder die Verstandesbestimmungen ihren eigentümlichen Inhalt und Werte nach. So the rational metaphysics did not interrogate, did not research the determinations of the mind according to their proper content and value. So it had no tool to analyze thought itself. Noch auch diese Form, das Absolute durch Beilegung von Prädikaten zu bestimmen. So it didn't research the Verstandesbestimmungen, the determinacy of the mind, but it didn't inquire after the proposition itself. They didn't inquire whether or not proposition was a proper way to express the absolute. And if you take a look at Spinoza, you read a bit of Spinoza, right?
Oh,
you see
yeah,
that
right.
he works
Thank
with
you.
definitions and axioms and propositions all the time.
Oh, yeah, I remember that in the beginning, yeah, he establishes definitions and refers to them continuously. Yeah, interesting method.
Purely deductive and analytical method.
Yeah, right.
Which, of course, was part of this rationalist metaphysics, together with people like Leibniz and especially Christian Wolff, which is the great teacher of Immanuel Kant.
Oh, I see.
The great rationalist metaphysics, you had that in very neatly, yeah. So we have the logic of being and the logic of essence and the logic of God and the logic of the world and the soul. God, the world, and the soul. That's
interesting.
An echo of what Kant said. And the three things were necessary to investigate and to understand: God, the world, and the soul. And everything deductive and analytical. Christian Wolff devised such a system. But Christian Wolff and others never investigated. Spinoza didn't either. He doesn't have an analysis of what it means to have a proposition, or what it means that we use simple predicates to express the absolute. The absolute is power, life, chemistry, everything that is like a predicate of the absolute. And that could be a Spinozan axiom. Everything that exists is an attribute of substance, which for him is a word for the absolute. And he gives an example here. This is a note taken from the notebooks that he himself wrote.
Oh,
that's an addition. So this is Hegel adding something to his own statement. This was the first publication, and then he said, solche Prädikate sind zum Beispiel Dasein. So such predicates are, for example, existence, Dasein. Like in the statement, God has existence, so God exists. Finitude or infinite, the infinitude. Considering in the Frage, considering the question whether or not the world is finite or infinite. It's a question that Kant wrestles with, and he called it an antinomy of the mind, that we have arguments both for the finity of the world and for the infinity of the world. But we can't solve the issue, can't solve it. Einfach, that is simple, in the sense of undivided. Zusammengesetzt, so composite. In dem Satz, die Seele ist einfach, the soul is one single reality. Die Seele ist einfach. Ferner, das Ding ist eines. So the thing is one single thing always. It has unity. It's ein Ganzes, it's a totality of its properties. Und so fort. That is the same as and so forth. Und so fort. Es wurde nicht untersucht, ob solche Prädikate an und für sich etwas Wahres seien. So, this thought in my mind, you should have investigated whether or not that thought in itself is true. They didn't do that. They presupposed the meaning of such concepts. So I would say they presupposed a kind of transparent language in which everything could be defined quite simply. I'm not sure that this rationalist metaphysics is not something that is still all around us. I mean, people might still think like that. Whatever is in my mind is surely something that is in reality. In politics.
Yeah, I agree. I think even just the fact that people speak regularly somehow presupposes, I think, their allegiance to rationalism, because if they challenged this very transparency of regular propositions as Hegel does, maybe they wouldn't speak in such a manner in the first place, very regular manner. So I think strictly speaking, even the action of speaking by using regular propositions, I think in fact is a proof that they somehow implicitly, whether they like it or not, do accept the rationalist thesis.
Yeah.
I think interesting. Yeah.
There's an interesting analogy with what happened in the Middle Ages when a painter like Hieronymus Bosch, he made paintings depicting demons and all sorts of punishments in hell. And people saw that and they thought it had to be real. Because how else could you make a drawing of something if it wasn't real? Because you had to see it before you made a drawing of it. So when people saw the Hieronymus Bosch paintings, they thought it was an actual depiction of reality. That's on the basis of the assumption that you can only draw what you have seen. So you can only make a picture of something that is real. Which helped a lot when they saw pictures of Christ or some other person from history. And then they tended to believe, okay, that's him, that's what he looked like. But then you get in the 19th or 18th and 19th century a different kind of assumption. Whatever you can say must be true because you can say it. If you can say it without contradiction, then it must be true. And that's how many people still nowadays operate. That if someone says something and it makes sense in itself, it must also be true. If Trump says there is a conspiracy going on, and this conspiracy wants to get me out of the presidency by lying about things that I do, well, that's a solid and understandable statement in itself.
Yeah.
And people will think, well, because he says it so eloquently or so basically simple, in such a simple manner, it must be true.
Yeah.
It's simply a statement of fact. It looks like all the other statements of fact that they believe in. So the form of the proposition is involved here. Everyone will understand that you can say the Earth is a globe or the Earth is spinning around the sun. That's a proposition that people tend to accept. So every kind of proposition that has the same form, the deep state is trying to kill Trump. This is a similar statement. Well, it must be true because it has been said out loud.
Yeah.
Nobody thinks about the conditions under which a proposition can be true or not true.
Yeah, right. That's true.
That's the naivete that we started with in paragraph 26. In the rationalist metaphysics, it's like a second level naivete. It's also naive.
Yeah.
And then we have a whole lot of stuff that comes from the students of Hegel. It's called Zusatz. It also means addition. And they are not always printed in or translated. I'm not sure what your version does.
Yeah, I think
does it
this
have
one
this? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. That's really great because I think it belongs to the existence of the Encyclopedia to have this included. Huh? to have also the notes by the students. They were collected some years after his death, and then new editions of the Encyclopedia contained also these notes. But it's not the language of Hegel that's easily discernible. You can easily see that. But it's the thinking of Hegel, but how his students have interpreted that. So just a little bit of this. Die Voraussetzung der alten Metaphysik war die des unbefangenen Glaubens überhaupt. So that's interesting. The conclusion that I just drew, that this is that rationalist metaphysics is a second-degree naivete, was actually drawn by one of his students. The presupposition of the old metaphysics was the presupposition of naive belief.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I just said as a, let's say, conclusion, that his depiction of rationalist metaphysics actually reinforces the primary naive way of thinking. Well, one of the students noted that. Maybe Hegel said it, maybe he didn't, but at least it's a fair conclusion from the former text. So there is this naive belief, dass das Denken, das Ansicht der Dinge erfasse. So that the thinking really grasps the in itself, the being in itself of things. That there's no phenomenon here, there's no appearance here. Things are what they are thought and not what they seem to be in our experience. Dass die Dinge, was sie wahrhaft sind, nur als Gedachte sind. But the reality, the truth of something is what the thought is. The appearance is how it is experienced. You can imagine, I mean, even if you look at the table is white, there's a nice passage in Husserl about our perception of things. When I say the table is white, to what extent is that an expression of my experience? There's this white table in front of you. You're standing here, and now you're looking at it. What is the only real thing you can say? The only thing that is really just an expression of your experience? Is that the table is white?
I would personally say that it is impossible to express in language what I say at all because of the horizon that surrounds every single word. So I can see a white table, but when I immediately see that table, that stage is fine. Just seeing it is fine. But when I try to linguistically explain what I say, I deliberately employ the term table and white, and I might truly be seeing the white table, but my problem is that this term table itself, upon employing it in my sentence, I am already somehow summoning a very long chain of etymology and horizon that surrounds the term, that the proposition itself is contaminated. And for the same thing, white, there might be moderately white and severely white, or maybe mildly white or whatever, but by deliberately choosing the term white, I am also surrounding a specific philosophy, the philosophy that a color should be defined in its own without dividing it into a sort of a spectrum. So I am already subscribing to a specific aesthetical doctrine, I would call, and even by simply using the term white, I'm also running a bunch of aesthetical theories and definitions that are endorsed by specific people, and I think this inevitably blurs what I am trying to say, the blurs the pure experience of that object. And this linguistic expression actually contaminates not what I see, but just how it is expressed. So I definitely see something in a certain manner, but upon trying to transcribe it in terms of language, I destroy everything. So my point is that there is no need to express what I say. I just think it looks like that, but I don't necessarily have to translate it in terms of language, and therefore just blur things and make things collapse and inaccurately, inevitably convey what I see, because that's impossible in the first place, because first of this bias in a specific word choice, and also the sense of horizon that just stretches beyond the word. That, yeah, I think that's really a massive problem. But yeah, perhaps my point is not pragmatic, because when it is true that my statements can never accurately reflect and also reflect in an unbiased manner what I see, then it would be possible to say that there is no point in saying this, because it compromises integrity and precision. But then when my logic is accepted, there would be no reason to say anything at all. And that would be, I think, pragmatically catastrophic. But in a simply descriptive sense, not an imperative sense, it is not that one should not speak because his language doesn't accurately reflect his experience. But my point would be that one can speak, but he still should acknowledge that his expression somehow contaminates his experience of an object. Yeah, just the language itself. I think perhaps other philosophers share similar views. Maybe, I'm not sure, but yeah, that's my view. Yeah.
Well, it sounds a bit like Parmenides, who says the only real
Oh,
thing you can say that it is, and everything that we add to that in terms of color and place and time is totally relative, and it's not really
yeah,
a
I would
statement about
100%
reality.
agree, actually. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
it's a very valid statement. Yeah.
That's quite interesting, because you're pointing to
Yeah.
the linguistic bias that we have, that we use
Yeah, right.
words. These words don't really accurately define or even describe what we're looking at. They're mere
Yeah,
words.
definitely. I think so.
So
Yeah.
then you would need to go to a more pragmatic approach and say, well, it's good enough. It's good enough in
Yeah, I
everyday
would say
life.
so.
But it's not
Yeah.
science. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I
Uh,
would say so.
yeah. So that's quite interesting. I was
Yeah.
actually looking for something else.
I see.
I was looking for the fact that if you demand that your statements are
Yeah.
connected to your experience, let's say that is a demand
Yeah.
that we have. Knowledge should be based on
Yeah.
experience, so expression of knowledge should refer to experience. The question then arises,
Yeah.
which is the typically Husserlian question. Uh, at the end of the 19th century, there was this feeling that we should return to a more realistic view of the world, which was
Oh, interesting. I see.
expressed in German as zurück zu den Sachen. So back to the things, back to the real
Oh,
things.
interesting. I like it.
Zurück zu den Sachen. And then Husserl came up with his great statement, aber was sind denn die Sachen? What are really things? If you look at what you would call, indeed, in this more pragmatic way, just using language that others will understand, but it's not really descriptively correct, and etc. You call it a white table. Well, is that
Yeah.
really what you are seeing? You are seeing a white surface. You're
Yeah.
seeing maybe some kind of shape. You might be able to detect whether or not it's two-dimensional or three-dimensional. But that is
Yeah.
really all that you can really see. So the
Yeah.
question, was sind denn die Sachen? What are things really? Well, in some sense, there are simply presuppositions.
Yeah.
We think that we should talk about the world in terms of the things that are in it and the qualities that they have.
Yeah.
But
Right.
that might not be a truly true understanding of it, as you have explained, because of this linguistic bias. And
Yeah. Right.
let's call it a naturalistic bias. The
Yeah.
linguistic bias is I can express whatever there is there, and the naturalistic bias would be, of course, there are things in the world that have property, because
Yeah.
that's the way I talk about them. But Husserl opened our eyes to the fact that what we see is not what we say that we see. We say that we see a table that is white,
Yeah.
but that is like in part that is an experience, white surface, certain shape, etc. And in part it's a deduction from that. It's something rational,
Yeah.
um,
That's true. Yeah. You're right.
because I can never see the table as a whole, but in my expression, in my proposition, It's the table as a whole. It's a totality that I'm trying to
Yeah,
explain.
right.
But I never see that. So my experience never covers the claim that I have in my proposition. And that can be quite problematic. Now, you ended by saying something like, okay, you liked Parmenides in this respect. And the only true thing we can say is it is. Well, take a look at the phenomenology of mind. The first and most immediate way of knowledge is the kind of knowledge that simply says it is.
Oh, wow.
And it doesn't go beyond that.
Yeah.
And Hegel analyzes that and says, but you are presupposing so much. Even when you, like Parmenides, return to basic statement it is, okay, you're presupposing that this it is valid for all time. Why do you say it is? Isn't it is and might be in the future, or it was already? What are you actually talking about? What is this time element of it? Secondly, who are you talking to?
Yeah, right.
If you approach the world only with the phrase it is, what do you do with the one you are talking to? Because you are using language. So you might talk about the linguistic bias all you want, but the linguistic bias at least presupposes someone to talk to.
Oh, well, that's very true.
And that's not part of the bias. So the interesting questions with this approach.
Oh, are those Hegel's criticisms of Parmenides?
Wow, in the phenomenology of mind, it's called sensuous
very groundbreaking ideas, I think. I think that I've heard Hegel's criticism. I think it might even be more accurate to say that the only statement I can say is the it, but not it is, because is or is not or will be in the future. This thing is definitely fluctuating.
Hegel thought of that. Hegel thought of that.
Yeah, I should get rid of
says,
it,
look,
actually.
sensuous consciousness only says this and that. That's how it starts.
Yeah, I like that idea.
And then Hegel explains that what it actually is doing, because he knows about Parmenides, that he's talking about the immediacy of being. So then it evolves into there is something. It is or that is. But he starts by saying it and that, or this and that. And by the way, very interesting. The Latin word hic, meaning here, evolved into ik, which means I in Dutch. So the Latin hic became I in English and ik in Dutch and ich in German. First of all, the first thing that people started doing is referring to themselves as over here. Like in a roll call, someone calls your name, Sevan, and you say, over here, I'm here.
Yeah.
And then this hic became I'm here. So there is an evolution from a consciousness that simply tries to point at something, which is called deictis, from the Greek word deixis, which means to refer to point at something.
Oh,
Deixis. Why is there a V in my text?
I think
that you